Let's bring you more now on the introduction of the national living wage. What impact might it have on the people who will receive it and the businesses who have to pay it? Will it mean job losses, as some people speculate? Might it accelerate automation, the eradication of some low-paid work altogether? What about the under-25s? Why won't they be benefiting as those older than them will be? Joining us to discuss that, Sam Bowman, who's Executive Director at the Adam Smith Institute, and Kylo Burt-Fulcher, who's with the Young Fabians. So we're bridging kind of both sides of the ideological divide on this one. Sam, let's start with you, if I may. What's wrong with this idea of the low-paid workers getting more pay?
If you raise the minimum wage too high, then it becomes unproductive and unprofitable for employers to hire certain people. Now, with the national minimum wage, we've mitigated this problem because the Low Pay Commission has always had the mandate to raise it so that it doesn't cause job losses. So it's always been slow, particularly in recessions. They haven't raised it too quickly. Now, it's different here. There isn't that mandate. And the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is projecting that the national living wage today will put 60,000 people out of work, which, when we're looking at 30,000 people in the steel industry, and rightly very concerned about them, I find kind of amazing that the government is going ahead with this, where twice as many people risk being put out of work by its own policies.
Kylo, do you understand that some businesses feel that where it comes to the real bottom rung of the employment ladder, people earning very little, that actually they're going to be simply priced out of the market?
No, not at all. I mean, firstly, businesses are always going to argue that any restrictions on what they can do, any compulsion for them to pay more than a certain amount is going to damage their business, because obviously their motivations are to make a profit. But the reality is that there's no evidence to suggest that this is going to lose people's jobs. There is some controversy over.
Kylo, you've got the Office for Budget Responsibility suggesting 60,000. There's an academic up at Brunel University saying the figure might be closer to 300,000. There's no evidence because it hasn't happened yet, but there's a lot of well-informed speculation that it is going to cost jobs.
Well, it's speculation. It's entirely speculation. And like I say, the evidence is very uncertain as to whether minimum wages do cost jobs at all. And what we know is that there are millions of people, roughly a third of the workforce, being paid the minimum wage. And that minimum wage is not enough for them to have a reasonable standard of living on. And so all of those people are going to be benefited because they'll all be paid, well, not quite enough. I'd like to see an actual living wage be paid rather than, something based on the cost of living rather than an arbitrary figure.
Like what, Kylo? What sort of talk turkey? What are the numbers you've got in mind?
OK, well, the Living Wage Foundation, through talking to people and working out what a minimum standard of living is, estimates that you need £8.25 an hour in full-time work in order to be able to have that standard of living, and it's £9.40 in London. So I'd like to see something like that be brought in by the government, and not a sort of rebranded minimum wage, but called the living wage to get some positive headlines.
Sam, isn't it the case that in terms of spreading the love around, the low-paid are a very good instrument of, in a Keynesian way, of, they spend their cash. They don't hoard their cash. They haven't got enough to save it. They spend it. So they're very good wealth generators, and therefore paying them a bit more has to be good.
Well, it doesn't if it causes 60,000 job losses, and that's the whole point here. In fact, the Keynesian theory of recessions, not to get into it in too much detail, is that the employers can't cut wages fast enough, so they end up having to fire people instead. That's exactly the same problem here. But just to go back to what Kylo said, I really can't believe my ears when he says that there's no evidence that minimum wages cause job losses. There are over 100 studies that look at the impact of the minimum wage, and they're all online, they're all free for him to look at, and the majority of them, not all it's true, but the majority of them show that minimum wage increases cut jobs. Now, the question isn't whether they cut jobs or not. The question is how much do they cut jobs. I think in this case, because it's being raised very, very quickly, it's being raised without concern for the job losses, unlike the minimum wage. I think we are into very, very dangerous territory. And the number of job losses, this 60,000 number, and that's the Conservative estimate, as you said, is something that the government is directly responsible for. And I think it should be taking a lot of the blame for in the months and years to come.
Kylo, we're going to be talking in about an hour's time to Fraser Nelson, editor of The Spectator, who also writes a weekly column in The Telegraph. This morning he says, I mean, you'd expect him to say this, I'm sure you'll say that, but
yes.
One of the things he says is that this is a real boon. It's a real boon for those people who want to automate and roboticize the low-paid workspace, because actually that's what's just round the corner. Now, it's not science fiction anymore. It's beginning to happen. You go into your local Tesco, you go to the checkout girl, guy has gone, there's a machine there instead. One of the impacts of this will be that it will accelerate that process of automation.
Well, firstly, I don't think automation sort of intrinsically is something that we need to fear. What we need to make sure is that where jobs are going to be automated, that the workers in those positions skills they need to continue being gainfully employed. But I think the idea that a 50p difference in the hourly rate for the lowest paid people is going to lead to a massive change in automation is simply wrong. Businesses would like to automate anyway. This might make them a tiny bit more, might make them a tiny bit more want to do that, but it's not going to be particularly significant. I thought that was actually one of the more bizarre points that he made. But returning to what Sam says, look, I mean, he says it's incontrovertible, but it isn't, because, as he acknowledges, many studies have shown that actually there is no increase in unemployment through bringing in a minimum wage or through raising a minimum wage. And the reason for that is because, obviously, it's going to depend on the exact level you set at and the country that you set at in. So, firstly, there is no clear evidence. But secondly, even if it were to happen, we're talking about a small number of people, possibly at some point in the future.
Sorry, Sam,
the majority of studies show this disemployment effect. So you can either look at the empirical evidence, which supports me, or you can dismiss it. You can't just cherry-pick studies that support your point of view. You have to look at the body of evidence. Now, the other effect that we see is the composition effect, which is it's not just how many people are employed, but who are employed. So because this is restricted to over 25s, usually it's teenagers who are most displaced. Now, because this is restricted to over 25s, that clearly won't happen. What we'll see instead, I think, is over 60s, people who are near retirement who are in minimum wage jobs, and they're actually the second largest group that are on the minimum wage currently. We'll probably see them going to early retirement, then being pushed out of the labour force, and other people possibly being drawn in who are more productive. Now, I don't regard that as a good thing. It causes invisible unemployment, where people who would like to work and like to be in the labour force are pushed out, and it doesn't seem to be a distributively good thing. It probably brings in second earners, people who are able to earn a bit more but have decided to have chosen to retire more. And what you may end up with is even more the real unemployment that we care about, which is to work, not being able to, and the people who actually get the jobs being the people who really we don't care about at all, people who don't need this extra money.
Yeah, go on, Kylie.
If you want to talk about cherry picking, what you're doing is ignoring the fact that there are millions of workers being paid the minimum wage who are going to get a very significant pay rise. But actually,
I'm not. I'm remembering that there are 60,000 people being put out of work. 60,000 people being put out of work. That's what you're ignoring.
Listen, look, roughly 1/3 of the workforce is on the minimum wage. Now, the best studies suggest that is not enough to properly have a minimum standard of living in our society. We've got to decide what we want work to be. Your kind of work is simply not good enough. It's paying people a poverty wage that the state then has to step in and support so they have enough money to buy food and they have enough money to heat their houses.
One argument that is ventured, let's just get away from how many jobs might be lost thing. One argument that is volunteered is this idea that if you are somebody, you're a sole trader who maybe occasionally takes somebody on, really at the very bottom, embryonic corporate level, and your wage bill is a big part of your business and the maths of the business, you're going to look very hard at the person you hire. You're going to think, can I afford to keep them on the books? Shall I put it off the books? Shall I go for the cash economy? There is a danger, is there not, Kylo, that we end up here with a lot of people being pushed gently off the books because these people want to stay in business and they want to keep hiring people, and it might be simpler just to pretend officially they're not hiring them.
No, I don't think that's particularly significant, and we already have laws to stop people doing that. We need to enforce them. But, those kind of arguments are always used to stop workers having rights, and we need to look beyond just allowing certain unscrupulous employers to do whatever they want because we're worried we can't enforce the law. But anyway, look, to return to, because Sam made a point about under 25s, one of the particularly problematic things about the legislation that the government is bringing forward is that it exempts under 25s from the increase. Now, under 25s, people who are old enough to vote, they're old enough to get married, they're old enough to fight on the front line, and many of them have been old enough to do this for up to 7 years. And this isn't a problematic policy in isolation. It's the latest in a long stream of government policies that negatively affect young people. The scrapping of educational maintenance grants, tuition fee rises, restricting housing benefits for under 21s. What is clear is that young people are simply not a priority for this government at all, and that's not acceptable.
Kyla, you probably didn't realise it, but you literally moved to the left as you were stating those policies, because the camera moved. Kyla Burt-Fulcher and Sam Bowman, thanks both very much indeed. Kimberly.
Thank you.
David Cameron has warned that terrorists will use whatever materials they can get their hands on as he arrived at a summit on nuclear security in Washington. World leaders are attending the conference amid concerns that Islamic State could try to create a so-called dirty bomb. Sky's US correspondent Cordelia Lynch reports.
There are two growing threats looming over every diner at this table: a nuclear North Korea and Islamic State militants developing a dirty bomb. The attacks in Brussels adding fuel to Britain's fears.
We know that the terrorists we face today would like to kill as many people as they possibly could using whatever materials they can get their hands on. And so obviously the security of nuclear materials for those countries with nuclear programs is incredibly important.
There haven't been many cosy handshakes between the US and China recently, but the two countries put on a diplomatic display of unity, agreeing to step up their efforts to confront North Korea's ambitions and try to stop smugglers selling nuclear material.
Of great importance to both of us is North Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons, which threatens the security and stability of the region. And President Xi and I are both committed to the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and full implementation of